Okay, welcome to the TheBodyCan radio show, everyone. My name is Randi Shannon. I am your host, and I am a certified natural health professional as well as a naturopathic doctor, and we are live. Today's broadcast is called Dirty Electricity. We at TheBodyCan.com believe that a healthy lifestyle doesn't have to be difficult or expensive. Alternative methods are generally cheaper, they're safer, and many times far more effective than drugs. With a few tweaks in our lifestyle, you might find that this is absolute truth. Our bodies want to be healthy. They are destined to be healthy, and it's very simple to do. You get a little bit of sunshine, you drink pure water, you avoid poisons, and, dirty electricity is a poison. So today, you're going to hear from Dave Stetzer, and he has an extensive background. He's an electrician by training. His education and experience, over 30 years in this industry. He joined the United States Air Force in December of 1970, and he began his career in electricity. He attended Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi at the electronics school there. And at the time, Keesler Air Force Base was known as the world's #1 electronics school. So during his training, Dave was given top secret military clearances. Much of the electronic stuff that he was working on, the equipment, was and still remains highly classified. Dave completed training as a ground radio communications electronics technician and was assigned to the 676 Radar Squadron at the Antigo, am I saying that right, Air Force Station in Wisconsin. And there he diagnosed and repaired a variety of electronic equipment as well as highly classified military electronic equipment. So we have one of the best qualified people here today to talk to us about dirty electricity, also called EMF. Am I right on that? Do we have the titles? They're both kind of one and the same?
One causes the other.
One causes the other. Okay. Well, good. Welcome to the call, Dave. You and I hadn't talked for quite some time. We did an interview a few years back, and I absolutely loved our interview. So much really incredible information came out, and so many people were interested in what you're doing, what you're talking about, and in the products that you have. So, if you would, go ahead and if I missed anything on your background, go ahead and add to that and just tell us, what is dirty electricity?
Well, dirty electricity, and Professor Martin Graham, who was a professor emeritus from UC Berkeley, he wrote a white paper, and he called it a ubiquitous pollutant. And that's ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere. And he described it and defined it there as electrical pollution. Now, somewhere along the line, somebody come up with dirty electricity, which is fine. But what it is with modern-day electronic devices, the sine wave, we have this AC sine wave, and it goes into our electronics, our TV, our computer, things like that. And all this electronic equipment runs on DC current. So we have to change the AC current to DC. In doing so, we chop up that sine wave and we create these little high-frequency transients. And it's pollution, electrical pollution, and these little high-frequency transients right on top of the 60-cycle sine wave. And so what happens is it affects people's health. That's a so what question, as well as equipment.
Wow, okay. Well, so, how is this a problem? Why is this such an issue today? Why didn't we hear about this years and years ago?
Well, years ago, most of our loads were linear loads, what we call linear loads. They were like light bulbs and motors, and if you remember, you went to your grandma's house, and they had a television and a radio, and you looked in and you seen these vacuum tubes. Well, actually, all the AC sine wave did is run a little filament. Remember the little glow in the tube? Well, that's just a filament, and then that filament heated this plate in the tube, and then it boiled these electrons, so that's how you got the DC current. So we didn't really have, it wasn't chopping up this sine wave. But what happened is we come along in the late 60s, started getting transistors, see? And so that turns things on and off. So if you went over to your light switch, for example, and you turned it on and off and on and off, and you put your ear next to it, you'd hear this little bzz, 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 the little arcing. Well, that's kind of like what's happening with solid state equipment. Okay, we have to change the AC to DC. So now we have higher frequencies put on the wire. So when the current goes in one way, it builds a field. When the field stops, when it reverses, it'll collapse that field. The problem when you start collapsing fields is it induces current in whatever's around it, okay? So now, like you take like a for example, compact fluorescent light bulbs, they'll reverse 50,000 times per second, between 50 and 100,000 times per second. A Mac computer, Apple computer, 12,500 times per second. So it'll put like 12.5 kilohertz back on all the wires. Like a Dell towers usually put 16.6 kilohertz back on the wires. So what happens if you made the human body into an electrical model, it would look like 3 resistors and 2 capacitors. Now, capacitors are short to high frequency. So anytime you get over 2 kilohertz, that energy dissipates internal to the human body. So we have these EMFs being created, high-frequency EMFs, created on the line due to these electronic devices. Then in 1972, there was an oil embargo. So we had to get more energy efficient. So what happened is we have more nonlinear loads. We came out with variable speed frequency drives, HID lighting, energy efficient lighting, things like that. So the problem just got worse and worse. So that's why you never heard about it, with your grandma and things like that. But now, since 1972, and then by 1980, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers knew it was such a problem, and it creates these harmonic currents and all these extra currents on the line, that they actually started making standards, and now they have the IEEE 519, they call it. So there are standards out there regulating this.
So this electrical pollution is coming from electrical wiring. So
it's on the wires. It originates with electronic devices.
Okay, so what's some of the symptoms of this EMF, of this electrical pollution?
Well, the Russians, at the end of World War II, radar was developed, and the Russians did a lot of research on this, and they called it radio wave sickness. So you can look up the symptoms, but like headache, nausea, things like that. Now, in 1980s, Dr. Robert O. Becker, who was twice nominated for the Nobel Prize, said that we are now being exposed to frequencies we've never been exposed to before. And he said it is the cause of the made-up diseases of the, of course he said 80s, but he named chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, ADD, ADHD. So if you look at the symptoms of those, and you look at the symptoms of radio wave sickness, headache, nausea, flu-like symptoms that don't break out, actually more serious things are like stroke, cardiac heart palpitations, things like that. So it's an array of symptoms. But then you can say, well, yeah. One guy said, well, you can go out on a mountaintop and have those symptoms. That's true. But if you go away from the mountaintop and the symptoms go away, and every time you come back to the mountaintop, the symptoms come back, then maybe you better look at the mountaintop. And so what happens is when you're in this dirty, like your offices, schools, homes, even if you don't have any electricity in your own home, okay, or not electricity, but any nonlinear loads or any electronic devices, if the neighbors have it, you still share the same transformer, and so you're still exposed to it. There's kind of like no getting away from it.
Right. Okay. So if somebody thinks that they're sensitive to this, they might experience nervous system problems or skin symptoms, pains, aches. I've heard of this, facial prickling. I've heard of people saying that. Eye symptoms. I've even heard of burning sensations in the eyes, sleep disturbances, big time, and the stress. All these things, of course, are on the rise. I mean, That's all we hear about. There's a pill and a drug for all of these things. So, what?
Yes, people get headaches, and migraine headaches, for example, and they go to the doctor. He gives them some drugs, things like that. Where maybe you should just look at your environment, because when we've went in and changed people's electrical environment, cleaned it up, those symptoms go away, and it isn't just psychosomatic. So there's a lot of people out there going to the doctor, getting drugs, things like that, and really, you can take them till the cows come home, and you're not going to get any better because it's your environment.
Now, I read that electricity generation is one of the leading sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. Is that an accurate statement?
That could be. I don't have any statistics on that, but it depends on what their, coal-fired plants and things like that would be.
What about the Wi-Fi? Are people, allergic to it, or what's going on with the Wi-Fi? How does that affect us?
Well, it affects you big time, in my opinion. But with the Wi-Fi, you're going to be affected by it. But it's going to give you, you might get cancer from it, but it'll probably take you 10 years, same as the cell phone, things like that. Where the dirty electricity, that's the most biologically active frequencies, according to the Russian government, the World Health Organization, the Japanese government, is between 4 kilohertz and 100 kilohertz. So if you remember between 4 kilohertz and 100 kilohertz, remember the Dell computers will put on 50 kilohertz, just the laptops. Smart meters. People got smart meters on their home. They have to change the AC to DC to get the transmitted signal out, so that will you get sick from the transmitted signal? Yes. But even if that was shielded, you would still be exposed to 50 kilohertz, because that switches at 50 kilohertz. It'll put 50 kilohertz in every wire in your house, in the neighborhood, even if you opted out. If your neighbor has it. Light dimmer switches are another one. So all those frequencies, remember the compact fluorescent lights, for example, the ones that look like a snake, between 50 kilohertz and 100 kilohertz. I tested 76 of them for Trent University in Peterborough, Canada, and not one of them was any good, And so, but it puts between 50 kilohertz and 100 kilohertz. That's all within that 4 to 100 kilohertz range that are the most biologically active frequencies.
Well, that leads to the next question. How do you actually measure this?
I measure it in gram, and professionals measure it with an oscilloscope, and you can actually see the waveform, and you can see the frequencies, and you can calculate it, or the scope will display it for you, whatever you want to do. But you actually can see the waveform. But the bad part is the oscilloscope costs a lot of money. They're like $5,000. So we did some research, and we were in Kazakhstan and Russia, and Russian scientists were there, and we showed them what was on their buildings' wires, and they said, oh my gosh, this is really dangerous, this is bad. And so, but we can't afford $5,000 for all our health departments. They call them sanitary stations there, but we can't afford $5,000 to supply, all our health departments with oscilloscopes, plus train them how to use it. So can you make us a meter that will measure the electrical energy that's on that wire? Now, what happens is they want an inexpensive meter. So if you look at, there's a guy named Maxwell Planck's law, energy is proportionate to frequency. So if you increase the frequency, you've increased the amount of energy. And of course, we have to look at the amplitude. So what happened is Professor Martin Graham, we developed a meter. It's a little inexpensive meter. There isn't even an on and off switch, no batteries to change or anything, and it's real simple. And you plug it in, and you get a number, you get a reading, and that will tell you if it's really crappy or not.
Okay, that's interesting. So, some of these things that you've been working on, kind of give a little bit of history of some of the things. You've gone into schools. You've actually been called to all kinds of different locations. Can you talk about that and give some examples of you measuring this and what you found and what happened?
Well, it originally started back in, we were working on some cows, dairy cows, and on farms, and these farmers would complain about their poor milk production. And, of course, they were worried about the ground current. And so we bolted 2 plates on the floor, and we logged the data. And we said, okay, so we had a computer program written for us to count the data, how many times these little transients, how many times a cow got shocked in a day. Then we looked at her daily milk production. And we did it for a long time, and sure enough, it's like a 99.9% correlation between the daily milk production and this. And so we wrote it up and we published it in peer-reviewed journals. Okay, but now the farmers said, this doesn't just affect cows. It affects people. My wife will go into the barn. She gets heart palpitations, things like that, and she'll pass out. They get her in an ambulance, and they take her to the hospital, which is an hour's drive. And when she gets down there, they can't find anything wrong with her. So then the question was, these farmers don't lie. I mean, they're honest people. So it's like, what's going on? And why, it's expensive to go to the hospital, so nobody's going to fake it. So we started doing the measurements, and so we said, okay, look, if it's this high frequency, and it's on the wires, and if we take it off, we figure a way to take it off the wires, and their symptoms go away, then that's kind of, A causes B, and we remove A, and B goes away, it's science. So we built the filters, and we seen what was on the wires, and we built filters, and I made a trip to Russia to find out several trips to Russia, and we found out which frequencies were the most biologically active, and we took those frequencies off. And sure enough, we enjoyed, tremendous results. We put them in a school. There was a school that was the teachers union was suing the school for not providing safe working conditions, and the school did everything in their power that they thought, and they still people couldn't stand to be in those buildings, and they looked at mold and all these things. So when we put the filters in, all their health problems went away. And in fact, we put them in November, and by May, the superintendent said that the filters had paid for themselves because people weren't calling in ill. They weren't sick. 37 kids had asthma in that school. The nurse had to give them their inhalers. Nobody uses the inhalers since. And she took it right back to the day that the filters were put in. So, yeah, we've had really, really good success with this. And there's been a lot of research done, so it isn't just hearsay. Of course, the 37 kids made the newspaper, but like Professor Magda Havas from Trent University in Canada, she did some research on this, several research projects, and all with statistically significant results. She used blood sugar as one thing where that's a number that's plotted against the number. I mean, maybe the Dalai Lama can change his blood sugar psychosomatically, but you and I can't. So if we change the number on the wall, we change your blood sugar. Professor Sam Milham, who was a very famous epidemiologist, did research, and he collected people's urine, and nobody had the neurotransmitters were coming out. You don't want them to come out in your urine. You want neurotransmitters like the electrical grid for your immune system. So nobody had less than 300 neurotransmitters in their urine. Within 8 hours after we changed and he collected it for 12 weeks too. But within 8 hours after that, nobody had more than 3 neurotransmitters in their urine, and dopamine levels changed like 50-some%.
Wow, that's crazy. So, go ahead.
No, so it's not psychosomatic. I mean, if you have a headache and we change your electrical environment and your headache goes away, we have no reason to doubt you, but we can't, it's like only you know that. But if we take your blood sugar, or we take the neurotransmitters in your urine, or we dopamine levels or something like that, and then we change it, and that changes, then it's like it's a for sure thing.
So what happened with the cows and things that you were doing?
Well, and that's very interesting, because if we can change that electrical, the cows respond really well and really fast too. We had one farm, for example, and they needed a new primary neutral, because this stuff comes out from the substation and it has to return back to the substation. And with all these high frequencies on the wire, the neutral wire, that's the one that takes it back to the substation, gets overloaded. So the electric utilities in 1992 elected to put it in the ground rather than put up a bigger wire. So by 1998, 70% of all the current that went out in the phase wires, the hot wires, returned to the substation via the earth. Well, where do you stand? Where are your water pipes? Where's that cow stand, see? So there's this one farm, and he was 7 miles out away from the substation. And so we put the electric utility, built a new line for him. And so we put a monitor in his barn. And there were 7 farms along that road. And nobody had less than 20 pounds per day increase in milk production per cow. Well, that's a lot of money.
That is.
So So, I mean, the cows, it's not psychosomatic. And we've done research. I have over 30,000 cows on film. Now, most states will say, adopted a rule from University of Wisconsin research. Douglas Reineman did it. And they adopted this rule that says, well, cows don't show pain until they get to 1 volt. Well, I'm showing pain, excruciating pain on the cows, dancing, kicking, and everything at 10 millivolts, hundreds of times less. And I have over 30,000 cows on film that shows the same thing. So the question is, how can that be, how can we be that far off, okay? So then when you read the paper, which was never published in any peer-reviewed journal or anything, the criteria was for pain. They put a pinch ring in the cow's nose, and they put her back feet on a metallic plate, and they turned up the voltage on a variac. They turned the voltage up until the cow experienced pain. When she did, they stopped, and it was 1 volt. But what they used for a criteria was they put 2 trained observers in front of the cow to watch the facial expression of the cow. Specifically, a twitch of the nose, blink of the eye, and a wiggle of the ear. When she did all 3 simultaneously, that's when they stopped. So that's junk science.
Yeah, that doesn't sound
So
legitimate. Who actually did that? Who was that group that did that?
That was the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The research was paid for by the electric utilities.
Oh, well, you got to follow the money.
Well, yeah, and I don't mind saying this on the radio because it's fact, right? And he was asked in court, even how come we had, such a difference in things, and I wrote him some letters, even said, hey, how do you come up with this? And he still never answered me. Where did he get the criteria? Because the Minnesota Science Advisors and everybody else says hoof lifting and kicking is a sign of cow discomfort from voltages coming across the ground. And that's really what our research shows, where the cows pick up their legs, they're breaking the circuit. They're in pain, they lift their leg, they break the circuit. Of course, the bad part is they got, 3 other circuits.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, they're not going to just, even if they want to stand on 2 legs, it isn't going to work. They're cows.
Right,
so.
Yeah. In fact, I do have them balancing. I do have a photo or a slow motion film where a cow is actually balancing. She's in so much pain, she's trying to balance on two legs.
Wow, poor thing. So this is just a farm that had a station that was 7 miles away.
And they started at the substation, and they built a new wire. See, they put up a new line out to this farm, but they passed 6 other farms. See. And so as they did it, then they're lowering the amount of electrical pollution on each one of these farms. What's happening is instead of being on the ground and things, these high frequencies are back in the wire.
Wow. Okay, so let's bring this into the home. I mean, the farmer, he's probably in a bad situation as well. Maybe his health is on the down low as well. What was his condition?
They were, yes, the farmers. And mental depression is a big thing. And one lady, for example, she was mentally depressed a lot. And so we went to the barn and we got the milk records. And when the milk was the lowest, she was the sickest. And when the milk was the highest, she felt better. But then they said, well, you know, when you have the most milk, you have the most money. When you don't have so much milk, right, then you're depressed because of financial reasons. Well, that could be, but then when you looked at the money that they had, the price of milk varies big, you know, like maybe $13 for a hundredweight all the way up to $25 or $30 a hundred or something, see? And so that didn't line up at all. What lined up was the daily milk production, because sometimes even though they had less milk, they had more money because the price of milk was higher. So it causes mental depression, heart palpitations, all, you know, rashes, all these things. So when we changed the environment, the electrical environment, okay, their health improved.
Interesting.
As well as the cows. As well as the cows. The cows, we use their milk production.
You know, I read Mythbusters did a show to find out if the unused sockets, you know, where you plug something in, used electricity when they were left on. You agree with that? The answer was no.
I agree with that. But there's two things. There's an electric field and a magnetic field. Now, when you have the breaker on and the outlet is just in your house blank, or there's a no current there. There's not a magnetic field, okay? But there's still an electric field.
Okay.
That's, yeah. It's like if you go to your light switch and you stand by the light switch, and then the light is off, there's no current flow. So there's not a circuit. But when you turn the light on, you create a circuit. So now there's a current flow, and of course your meter spins and you have a magnetic field. But if you turn it off, there's a pressure. Voltage is the pressure. And so there's an electric field on one side of that switch, you know, until you turn it on, you know, then you get a magnetic field. But Mythbusters is absolutely right on that the answer is yes to the current flow.
And, you know, going back to the farmer's wife, you know, not to kind of pigeonhole different people's jobs, you know, in the home, but if he's the farmer, he's outside, he's dealing with the animals and the machinery, et cetera. She's probably the one that's inside, you know, doing more things in the kitchen. She's around a lot of things that are plugged in. She's around all this electricity. So she's probably exposed to it, maybe even a little bit more.
Quite a bit more. Your observation's absolutely 100% spot on. The farmer's outside, yes, but he gets on a tractor, he's sitting on a rubber-tired vehicle, he's working out in the field, and she's sitting home baking, doing things like that, whatever. And, of course, most of the farm women help their husbands on the farm, so they're around the electricity more. They have chores. They probably wash up the milkers or something.
Okay, makes sense. So, you know, her health was probably a little bit worse potentially than his was. Now, you and I met. We haven't even said that during this interview, but I actually flew to Wisconsin and came up there and visited with you, and you did all kinds of tests on me. And I don't know if I've ever actually told you this, but I was sick as a dog after I left out of there for a multitude of reasons. But the main one was all of the things that I was exposed to. Talk about everything that you exposed me to, and then how you actually, you know, grounded me out.
Well, sure. The human body is made up of like 3 resistors and 2 capacitors, and you will store energy, and you will build it, and we can measure it. And when you were here, we were demonstrating what a light dimmer switch would do, for example, or a compact fluorescent light would do, things like that. We have a little test panel, and we'd show you on the oscilloscope the actual waveform and all those things. So yes, you're in that room, and we stood you underneath a fluorescent light, and we said, okay, here we have a meter we can actually measure the current in your body with. So we're measuring the current in your body, and then we can turn the light on, and we can watch charge up, and we can go ahead and say, okay, stand up, put your hand up next to the fluorescent, and we can watch the current increase, and we can say put your hand down, and you're not very tall, so you're probably safer than the rest of us. But nonetheless, and if you sat down, of course, you were farther away from the light. So we did all that to you. Yes, absolutely. Would you feel sick? I would be surprised if you did.
Please stay tuned for part 2. If you are interested in the meters and the filters for your home, please send an email to randishannon@gmail.com, RANDI Shannon, SHANNON @gmail.com. We'll see you on part 2.